All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you and welcome to this session of the Inclusive Excellence Week of the Elliott School. In line with our theme of sustaining inclusion and equity within international affairs, this morning, we will have a conversation on decolonizing the disciplines. This conversation will explore, among other things, why decolonization is not and should never be a simple metaphor. But before I proceed, I would like to acknowledge that the George Washington University resides on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples who have served as stewards of the region for generations. This morning, we are privileged to have a group of excellent scholars join us to share their insights on this theme. We have Dr. Diana Pardo Pedraza, who is an assistant professor in anthropology and international affairs at the George Washington University. Dr. Pedraza is an ethnographer of contemporary Colombia, interested in researching demilitarized rural landscapes, post-conflict politics and economics, and multi-species relations of aid and care in Latin America. We also have Dr. Eric Schlussel, who is an assistant professor of history and international affairs, and a scholar of the social history of the homeland, China and Central Asia. He previously taught at the University of Montana and has held fellowships from the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton and the National Endowment for the Humanities. His book, Land of Strangers, which won the Fairbank Prize in 2021, illuminates the lived experience of colonial dynamics on the edges of the Qing Empire. We also have with us this morning, Dr. Xolela Mangcu, who is a professor in the sociology department at GW. He is the author and co-author of 9 books and more than 24 journal articles. One of his well-known books is on race in contemporary South Africa, which was published by Wits University Press in 2015. Our moderator this morning is Julian Anderson. Julian is currently a junior at the Elliott School, double majoring in international affairs and economics, and minoring in Chinese. He's a research analyst at the Undergraduate Economic Society's Federal Reserve Program and a contributor at the US-China Strategic Studies Organization. Julian's research focuses on US-China relations in the areas of trade, energy, security, and Taiwan. Thank you very much for joining us. Julian, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Moses, for the introduction. I am very excited to be here to moderate a discussion with our excellent panel. Once our panelists give their brief remarks, we will move into open discussion. So how we go about decolonizing not just academia, but also the larger cultural practices is a key question in improving the world we live in. I am proud that the diverse experiences and expertise of our panel will give us great insight into answering that question. With that being said, Professor Pardo Pedraza, take it away.
Thank you so much for the invitation. So I think that to me, I want to start my remarks by saying that as indigenous scholars have taught us, and as Moses highlighted, decolonize is not just a metaphor, not just a word, and that despite all our efforts currently in academia to include decolonized thinking, we need to address the issue by understanding how the university itself is built upon colonial understandings, logics, and that indeed our ways of thinking are informed by these hierarchies of knowledge, right? So how can we decolonize the university? How can we decolonize our disciplines, what many of them actively participate and continue to participate in colonial logics, right? I am an anthropologist. I am in the anthropology department, and anthropology as a discipline also has troubling relations with colonial ruling. And the question of how to decolonize anthropology is not recent in my discipline, has been present for decades, right? We need to recognize the work of Black and Indigenous anthropologists early in the 80s and 90s who actually wrote books and texts and articles calling for decolonizing the discipline and finding a way to deal with not only our colonial past, but our imperial present. These conversations about decolonizing have taken more importance and are becoming more salient in the discipline nonetheless, right? Now in my discipline, we are talking about decolonizing biological anthropology, decolonizing the museum, decolonizing the history of anthropology. And I don't think we will have an answer today about that, nor I have it or pretend to have it. But I do think that, to me, it's important to recognize that we have been thinking about this issue, and by we think like, anthropologists, but also, and so this is not a recent conversation, and that we need to take into account how Black, Indigenous, peoples of color in the discipline themselves have put that conversation in front. I also wanted to highlight how our colonial relations are not in the past, but are deeply present, right? And so thinking about the colonizing is acknowledging how, once again, colonial ruling and colonial logics, colonial principles continue to shape our ways of thinking. And in that, I will say that decolonizing is not about only locality or geography or history in general terms, but it's an epistemological question, right? About how we are thinking about knowledge, the ways that we are asking our questions, the way that, for example, we are engaging with our interlocutors, right? Or informants, recognizing that they are not just that. They are not just there to provide information, but also have are intellectuals on their own right, and their ways of being and knowing and practicing are as valid and as important as the ones that we historically have deemed universal, right? I think that I will say that, and the last thing that I want to say is that to me, as a scholar of Colombia, as a Colombian myself, as a woman that migrated here to the US only 10 years ago, decolonizing is not only about inclusion, is not only about decolonize our syllabus by adding some voices here and there, right? Like a week on women, a week on other knowledge, because inclusion can be as important as it is, as central, as integral to what we need to become. It can be also very violent, and it can be just, mainstream. And in that is not sufficient. Those are my initial remarks, and I would love to hear what my other panelists will have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Mangu, would you like to follow up?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the best way for me to do this is from within the discipline of sociology in South Africa and in the United States. And I'm going to do this by telling just a couple of stories. The one is a longer story that has to do with how the departments of sociology were established in South Africa in the 1930s. And basically, they were established as part of what was called solving the poor white problem. And one of the founders, the most influential founder of sociology in South Africa was a man called Hendrik Verwoerd. Now that should give you reason for pause, because Hendrik Verwoerd was the founder of apartheid, and he was the leading ideologue of apartheid as a philosophy. So I need hardly say anything more, right? So it is a discipline that was founded to conceptualize and put into practice the philosophy of apartheid. And this was mainly at what I call the Afrikaner universities, right? What then happened is, right, there was a reaction to this from within the white academy itself, because Black people up until that time were almost non-existent in the academy. Well, they are still almost non-existent today, but I'll come back to that in my second part of the story. That then emerged from within the white academy an opposition to apartheid and an opposition to the kind of Herrenvolk nationalism that was being advocated by people like Verwoerd. But here's the point I want to make. The opposition came largely in three forms. One was basically liberalism, and it was the idea that race has got nothing to do with it. The other one was kind of a continuation of that in what became known as initially a Weberian approach to sociology. And then ultimately, there was a more radical Marxist approach. But then the problem with these responses is that it's a conversation by white people, among white people, about how they see the problem in the country. When I was a student at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, it was a time when Black students were not allowed to attend white universities unless you could feel you met certain requirements. There were certain loopholes that we had to navigate. At that time, I took a sociology class, my freshman sociology class. And they had done away with the Verwoerdian stuff, but the liberal and Weberian and Marxist sociologies were at the core. Well, they were the only syllabus, actually. Fast forward 30 years later, I go and join the University of Cape Town as a professor, as an associate professor initially. And guess what? The syllabus that I had to teach was exactly the same syllabus I had been taught as a freshman. Liberal, Weberian, Marxist philosophy. So over a period of 4 decades, even to this day, our students are taught the same theorists, Durkheim, Weber, and Marx, without even a pretense at any modification. Well, now there's been an adding on of W.E.B. Du Bois, an adding on, right? So there has not been an engagement with the very structure of the discipline. Because in South Africa, you have the white population is about 10% or just a little more, and yet they control 90% of academic positions, right? So, and the population is about 80 to 90%, the Black population. So 80 to 90% of thought in the country does not even feature in the syllabus or in the curriculum more broadly, right? And we are stuck on this Durkheim, Weber, Marx, right, paradigm. So I've been arguing more recently, not more recently, for the past 2 decades, perhaps, as a newspaper columnist, but also as an academic, that this is unsustainable. It's not only unsustainable, it's stupid. It adds nothing to the academic endeavor, right? It's a loss to our students. And so what I've been doing is I've been leading a number of initiatives to look at Black intellectual history and African intellectual history in particular, and bring what African thinkers were writing going way back to the 19th century and include that in the curriculum and make that, right, the center of what our students learn. And guess what has happened? And I'll conclude on this. Our students, particularly African and Black students, who had been struggling with some of these Weberian and Durkheim and Marx, right? And they were not, and some of them, not all of them, they were not doing as well, right? But once I introduced Steve Biko, once I introduced Mkai, once I introduced Mandela, all of a sudden, right, they were doing much better, much better than their white counterparts. The point I'm making is that there has to be a change in the overall design to center the African and the Black experience, not only because it's just politically necessary, but because it's intellectually the smart thing to do. That's how you, but there's been a lot of resistance by the 10% of the white population to this, because they control the universities. So there's a sense of not only a lack of inclusion, but a sense of powerlessness. And I always, when people talk about inclusion and representation and all of that, I always say, what about power? Because for as long as you don't have power to change the situation, you'll be running on a treadmill. You'll be running in the same place. So that's the story that I wanted to share with you guys. It's historical and it's structural. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mangu. Next up, we have Professor Schlussel.
Well, hi. Thank you also for having me here. I'm just going to say first, I apologize. I'm a bit ill. I'm going to try to keep my mind as clear as possible as I present a few remarks. And so I come from the discipline of history almost accidentally, in part because when I was first studying sort of Chinese history and then the history of the Uyghur homeland, East Turkestan, Xinjiang, it wasn't really possible to study it within a department of history. And in many ways, the world, academia still divides the world into people with history and people without history. And so often, if you propose a topic in anything having to do with China or Uyghur people say, you can't study that, it's not history, that's anthropology, that's area studies. And so that structure is still baked into the system. Consequently, for the past century, a large part of the story of the history of China in particular has been an effort to kind of, well, do inclusion rather than actual decolonization. It's an effort in many ways to assimilate the Chinese experience to mainstream notions of history and thus prove that it has history, which is of course really problematic. And I think that continues to this day. The idea of decolonizing history in the academy is also often about making space for certain kinds of voices, but almost inevitably those are voices that happen to agree with the person who's making the space and who are intelligible already within the framings that are already provided. I think that the best work has always pushed the boundaries of what we think history is. Now, history is about how humans locate themselves in narrative in relation to time, not just the past, but also the present and the future, the broader processes of change, how we construe the individual and collective subject in that broader weave of history, however we conceive of it. I think the most interesting work, and the work that kind of does the work of decolonizing, tries to undermine our hegemonic notion of what history is by taking seriously the frames that other people bring to it. The problem being that, of course, that kind of work does not get accepted very well in the academy. So this leaves us, what do we do in this field? First, we try to promote that kind of perspective, but it's difficult to teach that kind of perspective because it's not what students are expecting. We try to, as my colleagues are saying, bring in the voices from the place and bring in, broader sets of primary sources that reveal ways of relating to time and theories of that come from the communities themselves. weirdly, the tool of doing so, the means of doing so, is often one of the tools of colonial epistemology, and that is philology, and that is translation, which leads to its own sorts of ironies and contradictions. So I think, and this is the last note I'll put forth because it relates to my own particular experience with this, one of the problems we continually have when we say we're decolonizing history is that people will deploy frames from their particular sense of decolonization, or particularly it's a specific European, American, usually white understanding of what decolonization means, which is not the sort of authentic decolonization where you invert the power relationship. It's about putting people on the syllabus, or it's about finding a specific kind of sympathy with a certain kind of historical subject. In the China field, for example, lately this meant something which is on the one hand very, very good, which is taking, say, the experience of Marxism very seriously, taking Maoism seriously as an episteme. But on the other hand, that very attempt to reach out and to recognize and to decolonize often leads to a kind of fetishization of a certain kind of way of life. And so you have people who are sort of rightly sympathetic to people's experiences under Maoism, but then that'll often politically lead them to ignore contemporary power dynamics in China. I'm a historian of the Uyghur homeland, and in part I'm here because most of my colleagues who should be here right now are in prison. Not simply because they present alternative views of what happened in the past, but because in their research in history and anthropology, they've shown alternative ways of knowing the past and knowing the present and knowing the future. And so this leaves us in a difficult position in the academy, because in some ways, in order for history to be decolonized, it has to invert itself entirely. We can't just change our syllabi. We have to change the structures. We have to change the way that we do history. I think we have to change our very conception of what it is we're doing. And essentially and forgive me because I'm rambling again, I'm quite ill. Essentially to specifically teach and focus on things that undermine our very sense of our relationship to time. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Schlussel. I would like to move now to open discussion, and I will start by asking a question to our esteemed panelists, which is, how have your experiences shaped your understanding of decolonization, both inside and outside of academia? I'll direct this first to Professor Schlussel.
I'm sorry, again, quite ill. I didn't quite hear you. Please repeat that.
Yes, so how have your experiences shaped your understanding of decolonization, both inside and outside of academia?
Okay, if you're directing it to me first, yes, certainly. I think when I was young, when I was first studying the world, I had a little bit of that white savior complex you'd expect from someone of my age and my background. And early on, however, I heard a wonderful poem by Utguru Nunnaqul, who's an Australian Aboriginal poet, Leninist activist, in which I first heard the word civilized spat out in a way. And I think that initially the search for universals that we often pursue in academia was inverted or undermined by the realization that a lot of people don't want the universals that we impose from the position of the Western Academy. Later on, of course, again, by working with my colleagues in Urumqi and Lanzhou, in northwestern China, I've recognized that this power relationship plays out clearly in China, that history serves a certain form of settler colonialism. And that is, the responsibility of those of us with privilege in the academy to not just center the voices of people we find on paper, but to actually work with our colleagues and co-produce knowledge, right? To not have informants, but to have collaborators, and to have people we raise up and whose voices we place above our own. I've had my colleagues tell me specific things like, we want you to do X, Y, and Z. Can you do this because these are our current priorities? These are the things that we can't say. Can you say them outside of the Chinese Academy? And so I think especially this is the case where people say we're not supposed to use certain sources anymore in studying the past because they don't come from certain languages and certain traditions. So can you try to add meaning and validity and legitimacy to our practices by also doing them abroad? Yeah, so the tools, master's tools might not demolish the master's house, but we can at least use them to intervene in critical places where certain people who have power will hear certain kinds of messages. I hope that answers the question.
Yes. Professor Mangu, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I'm an African, right? So the concept itself illustrates the contribution of African thinkers to knowledge. I mean, the concept of decolonization, right, is a concept that emerges powerfully after the decolonization of African states, right, as a political concept. But it's a concept that is, you know, is advanced by Frantz Fanon, by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, right? So that's the first point I want to put out there, that we owe Africa that kind of acknowledgement of the role it has played in the development of this concept. Secondly, I was a political activist in the Black consciousness movement under Steve Biko in South Africa. I lived in the same township as Biko. Everybody spoke Black consciousness. And then when I was at university, I was the head of Black consciousness at the university. So I've always lived and breathed decolonial thought. And then, of course, I've brought that experience to my work as an academic. But I've worked with people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and a whole lot of African scholars who have been intimately involved with the concept of decolonization itself.
Thank you. Professor Pardo Pedraza.
So thank you so much. And let me say that, I really appreciate, the panelists today. I have learned a bunch in this half an hour. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. So as I mentioned before, I am from Colombia, and I think that particular positionality, I'm from urban, like middle class, no middle class, working class, Colombia, and in Latin America, we have had debates, our own debates about decolonization, right? Our own critical tradition with decolonization that shares some of that political struggle with African nations, but also that bring about another kind of engagement, one that calls for understanding how coloniality, right, is still ongoing, right? And the concept of coloniality versus the idea of colonial ruling, or trying to point out how our lives, our ways of thinking, our ways of being are already forever transformed by this violent encounter that is continue. And I bring up my, my origin and the fact that Latin America has had its own conversations about decoloniality, to say that I have as well, since very young, engaged with the concept, not necessarily through social movements, but through intellectual critical work in the academia. I have always been a scholar. And my own encounter with these conversations have brought me to be critical of the way in which decolonial has emerged in the US in the last couple of decades, right? Where it seems that it's as a term that we attach to certain scholars that generally are white, critical theory, that continue from within the Western thought, critiquing the Western thought, right? Not acknowledging how people, for example, from Latin America have been conceptualized that and have lived and struggled and you know, embody what the colonial struggle is, right? In fact, there is a very known important sociologist, Silvia Cusicanqui, who thinks about decoloniality in Latin America, I'm sorry. And she actually is very critical on the way in which even the idea of decolonial thinking have traveled from Latin America to the US, like pretty much like me too, right? Like from Colombia to the US, saying and arguing how even we Latin American scholars are participating in the depoliticization of the concept by not understanding and not foregrounding the way in which it's not just a theory or a concept, but actually a political lived struggle. And that many of the people that we cite from Latin America that think about decolonizing, like for example, Mignolo or Santiago Castro, who are, you know, critical thinkers from Latin America, but localized, not all of them, but like some of them localized in the US Academy. Those people even, you know, are depoliticizing the concept and taking it without acknowledging how the concept has and the political struggle has come to be in, like, you know, in Latin America in the ground, and actually point out to the geopolitics of knowledge, right? The fact that these white Latin American scholars that are now located in the US, their works are translated. The works are accessible, whereas the other works of people thinking and doing decolonizing in the ground are not even translated, right? Like I myself struggle to find good translations of these scholars to include in my classes because I don't want to include the same text from Latin America, right? And so I'm like, okay, let's try it and articulate, and I bring them and I tell my students, actually, this text that you are reading here is a translation. It's not necessarily a very good one, but let's think about that. Let's think about the geopolitics of knowledge. Who gets translated? Who is brought up, right? How do you have access to it, right? Who becomes the face of a particular definition of what the colonial thinking in Latin America is, right? I don't know if I am answering the question, but like, you know, I think that all of this is kind of showing how my own process from coming from the Colombia and like being raised and have education there until my master's and coming to the US have allowed me to see this geopolitics of knowledge and how even Latin American scholars with the best intentions participate in the depoliticizing of a very political term.
I actually want to ask a follow-up on that. So thank you for that insight, which is, so you're critical of Western scholars critiquing decolonization or talking or advocating for decolonization from a Western perspective, and how that takes away from the lived experiences of those in Latin America. So what role is there for Western scholars in forefronting those experiences? What can they do to do that?
A difficult question, right? Like, I think one of the, I think that, first of all, it's important to take away the protagonism and, like, you know, give sight to these scholars that have been historically done the work, right? I think that we need to not only acknowledge, but and say like, oh, look at them, right? They are doing that work, but actually step away a little bit and give the space, the stage to these scholars and people that are doing the work. But I know, and I hear my panelists, my co-panelists, because I feel that effort is very difficult when, even if you have the intention and the desire, the institutions themselves are not orchestrated to allow that, right? And by that, I mean, even like the most basic logistical aspects of it, of like how to recognize these people that are working and invite them to events and, you know, have translators and pay them for their time. And, you know, so all of that, that is very basic logistics. At times, many times, is very complex, right? Let's think, for example, not necessarily about, oh yes, decolonizing too. Like I have had experiences, me and colleagues of mine, where we wanted to include people in our classes that are undocumented, people that are not, they don't have like, you know, legal papers to participate in our classes, to, you know, give their insights, to tell us about their stories in classes. And yet these people cannot be paid. These people cannot be legally recognized because their own like material position, right? And so this is to say that I feel that we all have the responsibility as scholars and individuals to step aside and give the space for people to tell their own stories, to do their own narratives, to actually tell us how they are conceptualizing their stuff, right? Because they are not just merely informants, but also it's not an individual thing. It's not about me, Diana Pardo, Pedraza in her Latin American anthropology class, right? It's the institution, the academia, George Washington University, the academia in the US, allowing and creating the conditions for that to happen. When I say creating the conditions, I am talking about the most basic things, like the logistics, so I can pay somebody that is not documented, as well as, you know, allowing me to create classes that push against, you know, what, conventional academia class could be, for example. I don't know if that once again answered your question, but yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you for that perspective. We will now be moving on to Q&A from the audience. So the first question, this one will be directed to Professor Mangcu first. Has the rise of post-colonial studies as a field actually stunted the decolonization of your respective disciplines? That is, by creating a new kind of academic space to examine colonialism and colonial legacies, has that allowed us to sort of cordon off the ways colonial legacies and premises have more deeply infiltrated your disciplines?
I don't know why that question is directed at me. I'm not necessarily the expert on this concepts of I don't know if anyone feels better qualified. So does anybody want to take on that question? I don't want to presume to know that what the concepts actually mean when there are better people who can do it. So I'm going to pass.
If I may. Oh, no, go ahead, Eric. Go ahead. I just talked.
I was going to dwell
Professor
briefly on Professor Pedraza's previous really excellent comment to say, look, on the one hand, yeah, it's cordoned off the other parts of the world. On the other hand, I'm not sure a position like mine would exist without things like schools of international affairs within the American Academy. Universities are collections of resources, and if you use them strategically, you can do things like what Dr. Pedraza said. You know, I can bring the greatest living Uyghur historians into my classes and into seminars and make sure that they have resources from a university, even in exile. So even if epistemologically it might keep it separated in that way, it's a great grounds from which to fight.
100%, I agree with that. And, you know, let's acknowledge the fact that we are professors in a university that has resources and that we are committed to it. And yes, if we need to fight from where we are, I agree. And the university is a great space for that. In relation to the post-colonial studies question, is that right, Julian?
Yes.
My only reaction to it is to point out how many scholars that are engage with the coloniality, at least, with the coloniality as both an epistemological approach, also a political engagement, and a methodological perspective. All of them are not all of them, I'm being generalizing. Most of them acknowledge how post-colonial struggles have been central and important, and post-colonial studies, right, and the bringing of the subaltern to to the forefront have been important. But I will say, and this is something that I teach my students, they have been also very critical about this idea of the post-colonial, right, and the temporal the temporal assumption that goes into it, right? They appreciate and they are in conversation with these post-colonial studies, but many also point out how the idea of post assumed that the colonial ruling ended, and therefore we are in a different time. And what these decolonial studies scholars and political activists say is no, right? Coloniality is ongoing. And we actually need to think about colonial legacies, but we also need to talk about colonial and imperial dynamics that are still here in the present. And so they complicate. They are in dialogue, but it's a critical dialogue where they see the value of post-colonial studies and the concern with the subaltern and power relationships, but they are also concerned about what the temporal understanding might end up maintaining, right?
Thank you for your answer. I'll move on to the next question, and this one is for Professor Mangcu, which is, what do you believe is the quickest and sustainable solution for the uncorrelated representation in academia in South Africa? Why is so much aggression and persecution experienced when this generation seeks to study and understand its true history? Why is leadership seemingly not acting or lacking in courageous decisions that will result in a necessary change?
Now, there's a question I can answer. For the past 2 decades, 3 decades, we've had a lack of commitment by the leadership in South Africa, a lack of interest in the intellectual endeavor. And through my newspaper columns and my public talks and my books, I've been saying this in South Africa. The problem is the people who lead the country are corrupt. They are corrupt. And because they are corrupt, they have no interest in academic issues and intellectual issues. They're only interested in self-enrichment. And I hope this webinar is watched in South Africa, because I'm not saying anything new here, right? So what has happened is that when students, after 25 years of freedom, students at the University of Cape Town and at Wits University rose up in protest. They said, we can't continue with this anymore. We are powerless within our universities in a supposedly free and democratic South Africa. How is that, right? When students did that, the very same government was as unsympathetic as you can get and as cynical as you can get. So, when I say Black academics are powerless, I should therefore qualify that by saying, actually, in South Africa at least, we have a lot of power. We have a government. We have all these billionaires who could invest in intellectual empowerment, but they're not doing it. They're just doing the opposite. So, we're not entirely powerless. We just don't have the commitment by the leadership. And so you get to a point where you ask ourselves, well, what do we do? What do you do? And I think that this has been a problem, not just in South Africa, but in other countries as well. When you don't have the leadership, the commitment of resources, it's not like we couldn't do this stuff. I mean, as a professor, I have had students, white students, some of them, right, where I've said, I'm going to supervise you to do your thesis or dissertation on S.E.K. Mkhai, right, who is not known in the white academy, but is one of the best thinkers in the history of South Africa, right? I'm able to guide a student through that process, right, on my own. Imagine if you had resources poured into those kinds of initiatives by government and by the Black billionaires, you'd make a much, much greater process. So we're not completely powerless. It's just that we are irresponsible, or they are irresponsible.
So do you think it's partially a socioeconomic divide or a class divide that is part of the reason why there is that struggle?
Well, it's always been a class divide, but what you're talking about here is a lack of political seriousness, is a lack of political commitment to the intellectual endeavor by the political leadership in the country. There's just no way of getting around that. And unless that changes, we'll be stuck in this situation. And the students will forever be rebelling because there are no resources, there are no professors, Black professors at the universities, there are no research institutes, and yet you control the purse. It's a tragedy, actually.
Thank you for your insight. I have a question for Professor Pardo Pedraza, which is, how do you recommend that faculty decolonize their classes most effectively?
That's a question that I ask myself constantly. I will answer by saying that I think including other voices in our syllabus is a point of a start, a point of departure, but it's not the end. And I think at times that it seems to be what is the answer at times, right? Like, let's include voices in our syllabus so it's diverse enough. And once again, I think it's valuable, it's important. We need to do that, but it's not enough, and it's not the end point. And I will repeat what I said early on in my initial remarks, which is, if not done correctly, inclusion can be very violent, because you are not putting the people or the text or the concept or the epistemological framework in conversation with larger issues, right? Or if you put one text, but you don't unpack the relation, that text in relation to other ways of knowing, or unpack this text in relation to this so-called universal way of knowing, you are not doing much, right? The same if you just position a person of color and you diversify your faculty, but you don't provide the spaces for them to thrive, the spaces for them to actually make a dent and like a mark, not a dent, but like a mark, an important mark, right? Like, you need to, and I know that I'm repeating myself, but I think that right now I'm thinking so much about creating the conditions, right? Because I think that creating the conditions means understanding that things do not live by themselves, that there has to be a condition for them to not only exist, but like grow, right? To extend, to like actually make a change. And so let's, include other voices, but let's put them in conversation in a way that allow us start like shifting. So I will say that, right? Like not just include people in your syllabus that are like, otherwise, but actually create and actually bring a lot of them so they can like, thrive. The other thing that I will say, and I think is one that is related a little bit with Joe's question that I think is later, I try my best to make classes that are kind of transmedia. And students here, I learned, I'm new to GW, by the way. This is my second year, and it was like second year during the pandemic as Moses, and I am not sure if Eric too, but and so I came like, let's do something different. Let's do photo essays. Let's do like, other ways of knowing, and like bring photographs and like poems. And the students were like, no, I want to write an essay, like with the fixings and the argument. And I think another way that I'm learning, not yet how the solution is, to try to articulate other ways of producing knowledge, right? Like through, like, for example, visual media. And now I'm also thinking about how can I articulate sound. So it is a more like multisensorial way of learning. But I also am encountering, some resistance. And so I am still struggling with how to teach my students that there are other ways of producing knowledge that are not just written form, and they are valid and they are as rigorous, but students are accustomed to something else. So I'm going to say that.
Thank you, Professor. So on that same subject, I'm going to direct this to Professor Schlussel, which is Joe's question. Thank you for this interesting and important panel. I'm wondering how we can bring in and use knowledge that does not come in standard Western forms, written word, into standard Western disciplines.
I think Mr. Pardo Pedraza was just beginning to answer this question very, very well, I think. It's about how you get students to encounter these kinds of knowledge and these kinds of ways of being. We struggle here because you have to meet students where they are. And I find a certain amount of, if you'll forgive me, a little bit of a shock can often be useful. So obviously it's the Elliott School. If I teach Uyghur history, I have students who want to know, where did the re-education camps come from? And that's their primary question. If I teach Chinese history, I get students who just want to know sort of, how do I apply this knowledge often? And the solution I find is often to begin with, for example, the way that people relate to time through ritual, song, and movement, and to sort of emphasize that at the outset. And some people unfortunately drop the class, but others agree to sort of go with it, and gradually, you see how this basic framing, this basic way of interacting with the past actually deeply informs all that comes after, even when it's covert, or even when it's sort of an underlying assumption that's unspoken within the later sources that we read. So I find it's useful to pose a challenge early on, but the way that we do that, I think, depends very much on how we understand our student body. Although I suppose the question is more broadly about the disciplines as well. I think in some ways, actually, it does begin with the same place, because the way that we approach things in our disciplines now has a lot to do with how we were taught 10, 15 years ago, and the kinds of things that we intuitively accept as being legitimate in scholarship. I could say more, but we're short on time, so I'll be quiet.
So thank you for that. You, Professor Pardo Pedraza and Professor Schlussel, you seem to think that academia or the disciplines themselves should be more antagonistic towards the past knowledge, towards the institution itself, in order to decolonize. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Can I jump in here while they're thinking? I don't think that's really the way to frame it. The way to frame it is, for example, there's a book by Alden Morris, and I'm giving out a shout out for this, but it's called The Scholar Denied, right? And it's about W.E.B. Du Bois. as a founding figure of sociology in the United States, right? So it's about saying what you are teaching me is not true, right? Here is the truth. That's what students need to know, is like, what is the actual truth? What is the historical truth? What about Anna Julia Cooper, right? What about a whole range of people, Steve Biko, right? In other words, you're not doing anything that's antagonistic to anything. You're just saying, here is the academic, historically correct thing to do, which is to speak the truth.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, which is from Pagrathi. How can students facilitate and support the decolonization of the disciplines within the university? This is for all of you.
Ask, demand, articulate what it is you want. I find professors are willing to do a lot more than one might realize, but often we're trapped within this system that says, well, if you don't offer this kind of class and this kind of framing, then no one will take it. Or we're told that, well, that's risky because all of these things involve resources. The administration doesn't necessarily believe us when we say these things, but they're responsive to what students demand, I think.
I will say the same thing as Eric. I think our students are very well informed, and they have so much resources that many of us don't even know. And I consider to be a young scholar, and sometimes I'm amazed what my students have access to. And so, and I know I have wonderful glimpses of their critical insight. And so I will say, cultivate that critical insight, ask difficult questions, be playful with your thoughts, right? Because I think, because we teach in the Elliott School, our students are, very committed, as they have the right to have a particular path, right? And they are looking at the future in a particular way. And that's great, and they have all the right to do so. But I think that they also need to be a little bit more adventurous at times. And I think the classroom is a space where you can do that. You can be adventure with your thoughts. You can ask questions that are difficult to answer. You can just I would say be adventurous and critical.
Professor Mangu, would you like to add your thoughts?
No, I mean, they couldn't have put it better. When a student is given a class on Durkheim and Weber and Marx, just ask, where's Du Bois? Where's Anna Julia Cooper? Where's Biko? Where's Amy Cesar? Where's Paulo Freire in what you are taught, in what you are teaching me? That's what students need to do, is to push, keep pushing.
Thank you all for your wonderful perspectives. That is all the time we have. So this constitutes the closing of the event. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.